Hi, I'm Linda Mall, and welcome to Art This Week. On this week's episode, we visit the Blanton Museum of Art and speak with curator Beth Shook about the exhibition Impressionism and the Caribbean, Francisco Oller and his Transatlantic World. Now for Art This Week.
I'm here at the Blanton with Beth Shook, and we're here to discuss Francisco Oller and his exhibition, Impressionism at the Caribbean, Francisco Oller and his Transatlantic World. Thank you so much for speaking with us.
Thanks for having me.
So I thought we would start the exhibition in this front room, which has his self-portrait. And if you could kind of give us a little bit about the background of the man and the exhibition as a whole.
Sure. So Francisco Oller is basically considered the kind of father of modern art in Puerto Rico, the major Puerto Rican artist of the 19th century. He is an artist who grew up in Puerto Rico, but ended up spending more than 2 decades in Europe, mainly in Paris and Madrid, sort of studying and kind of traveling back and forth between Puerto Rico and Europe. Through all these travels, this is how he comes to sort of integrate European avant-gardes into his own art and bring it back to Puerto Rico. So this exhibition sort of focuses on Oller and his life and his career, but it also uses his career as kind of a lens for looking at these kind of broader transatlantic narratives in the 19th century. So it's a very broad exhibition that we're excited to have.
Yeah, he seems to have borrowed a lot, but then used that to really examine a lot of cultural hot topics for Puerto Rico as a whole.
Yeah, definitely. You know, I would say Oller was close friends with a number of the major painters of the late 19th century in Paris, the Realists and the Impressionists. And despite the fact that he was very exposed to these like very radical trends, he really sort of picked and chose what elements of their techniques and their styles he wanted to bring into his own art. I think he was very deliberate about that. Didn't feel like he needed to be the most avant-garde artist, which I think there's something to be said for someone who's very sort of purposeful about what kind of styles to bring into his art. So yeah, he sort of picked and chose different styles and then integrated them into very Puerto Rican subject matter. And he becomes sort of known for building this kind of first national visual vocabulary for Puerto Rico.
If you could tell us a little bit about this Millet work with regards to how Oller's travels in France influenced his work and the styles that he eventually took back to Puerto Rico with him.
Yeah, absolutely. So the major movement in French painting in the late 19th century that influences Oller is realism. And this painting, Shepard Tending His Flock by Jean-Francois Millet, I think really typifies what Oller was drawn to in realism. So this is a painter who's one of the founding members of the Barbizon school outside of Paris. These are artists interested in plein air painting and sort of depicting their surroundings by painting outdoors. The realists are also very interested in depicting what they can see directly. So you suddenly have artists focusing on everyday subject matter and sort of monumentalizing subjects like this one, like a rural worker, in a way that hadn't been accepted in the academy for a long time. And so even though on first glance I think this painting can look sort of romantic, if you look at how the light filters through the clouds, when you look closely, you see that this shepherd is sort of hunched over. He has this kind of reddish, weathered look to his skin. He seems to maybe be gasping. I mean, these are artists who are sort of beginning this very socially conscious kind of art making. And they're also making art that's very specific to a moment and a place, which is sort of France in this kind of pre-modern moment. And Oller really seizes upon this idea. He's very attracted to the idea of specificity of time and place, and of sort of painting these everyday figures who have been sort of written out of painting for a long time.
This Oller work, I think it's worth noting that, you know, Oller had a lot of had made connections with the artist community in France, specifically with Cézanne and Pissarro, and how he, I guess, spent his time in France and what he was able to accomplish. So if you could tell us a little bit about that.
Sure. So early on, he's very influenced by the realists and experiments with that kind of language for a long time. But over the course of several trips, he makes 3 trips to Paris, and it's really in the 1890s when sort of Impressionism has kind of fully developed as a movement, that he becomes really drawn to Impressionism. And in paintings like this one, you can really see how he's starting to experiment with Impressionist strategies. Of course, Impressionists were interested in depicting sort of the effects of light and atmosphere on sort of how we perceive our surroundings. And so here you can see that he's used this classic Impressionist brushstroke, this very quick, short brushstroke, sort of increasingly dot-like in this painting. How he's used light in the painting also, clearly very Impressionist influenced. And this is a moment when he's looking at artists like Monet, who he had studied with 30 years earlier, but who is one of the major artists still sort of experimenting with Impressionism at this moment. And we also have sort of example of his influence from his good friend Camille Pissarro, another major Impressionist, in this sort of scene with the woman and the geese here, as sort of borrowed motif from Pissarro paintings. So this is a point when this is when he takes Impressionism sort of to its furthest point in his own career. But I think it's a really sort of lovely and successful kind of foray into that style.
For this Oller work, he had just returned to Puerto Rico from traveling throughout Europe. And I think it's really interesting to note how he brings back all of those European influences, but makes this a distinctly Puerto Rican painting. So if you can tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, this is one of my favorite paintings in the exhibition. Here, you know, we've talked about how Oller is influenced by the Impressionists. And one thing you find when he goes back to Puerto Rico and paints Puerto Rican subjects is that he's a little more restrained with how he uses Impressionist strategies. So here what he's done is depict a really iconic sort of symbol of Puerto Rico. So at the center of the composition, you see the ceiba tree, a kind of tree indigenous to Puerto Rico. This is a tree that was important to the indigenous Taino people of Puerto Rico, who used its bark for canoes. And this particular tree, which is in Ponce and actually is still in Ponce today after hundreds of years, is believed to have been, some believe that it was actually there in Ponce when the Spanish first arrived in Puerto Rico. So it's sort of a very important national symbol for the Puerto Rican people. And here Oller has sort of borrowed some elements of Impressionism. Again, that kind of dot-like impressionistic brushstroke, this juxtaposition of a huge variety of different shades of green, and this lovely kind of reflection in the water here. And he's used these to kind of, I think, lend significance to this sort of important national icon.
So here's another Oller painting. This one is Hacienda La Fortuna. And I think it's very interesting to note the difference between this one and the ceiba tree painting, and still what it says about his home country.
Yeah, absolutely. So this painting and a number of hacienda paintings or sugar plantation paintings that Oller did were made in the 1880s, sort of in between his trips to Paris. And this is another sort of way that Oller is developing this national Puerto Rican visual vocabulary. He's painting the sugar plantations, which for so long had been sort of the backbone of the Puerto Rican economy, but are now starting to fade because now we're a decade after slavery has been abolished. One thing I think that's interesting to note, and you were pointing out in these paintings, is that again you see Oller sort of applying increasing restraint with how he uses Impressionist techniques. So we see sort of some hints of that in how he's kind of depicted the atmosphere of this painting in the mist sort of on the ground here. But for the most part, it doesn't feel entirely Impressionist, and it actually feels somber in a lot of ways. The work just seems to be sort of muted, not a lot of sort of major activity here that would be necessary for one of these kind of factories to thrive. And I think that's part of the reason why Oller didn't, choose to paint an Impressionist image. I think he was very purposeful about when subjects and moments sort of called for that kind of avant-garde painting. And so he's very deliberate in these images. Another thing that comes out here is that Oller was an abolitionist for most of his life. And so here you do see vestiges of the kind of work that used to go on plantations. You have like the former slave quarters over here. You have many Afro-Puerto Rican people working here. And I think this is a very intentional reference to the kind of suffering that once went into making these places thrive.
With this painting, the school of master Rafael Cordero, another Oller portrait, but very different from his more formal portraits. I know Cordero in this setting had started the first school for freed and enslaved slaves' children. And so you really get the sense of his control over chaos. So if you could tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah,
please.
definitely. Yeah, I keep saying I think teachers who bring their groups into the museum will sort of empathize with this look on the teacher's face here. But no, like you said, this is a really fascinating portrait. Cordero is the first person to open a school for male children of all races and all social classes, and you can see that sort of Oller has really purposefully included children of different races in the image. Cordero's thought of as sort of the father of public education in Puerto Rico. Still very important name today, as he was during his life. Oller lived near him, so certainly would have run into him. But this is actually a posthumous portrait that Oller paints for the Puerto Rican Athenaeum, which is a major cultural institution in San Juan that's still there today. Here, Oller has depicted Cordero in his workshop, which is where he made cigars, and so you see tobacco and sort of tools of his work here. But it's also his classroom, and you see him sort of with this group of somewhat unruly children, and he's teaching directly this one student, and I think Oller very purposefully chose to include a white student who probably came from a more privileged background here to show this ideal of kind of a happy coexistence of races in Puerto Rico. This is a moment kind of leading up to the turn of the century when education is becoming an important idea for the unity and nationalism of the Puerto Rican people. Oller himself opened, over the course of his life, 10 art academies in Puerto Rico, of which there hadn't been many before. A number of his academies are free, many are only for women. And so I think he's aware of himself as part of this lineage of the history of education in Puerto Rico. And I think he's also thinking about ways that the sort of mixed race identity is a part of Puerto Rican nationalism as well. And so you see that all in this image. But it's, I particularly like it because it's such a warm, empathetic image, and you really sort of connect with this gaze of Cordero in a way that you don't with every other portrait.
We want to thank Beth for speaking with us. For more information on the exhibition, go to blantonmuseum.org. That's it for Art This Week. Thanks for watching.
I still got your Polaroid.